10 years ago, Keanu Reeves and Morgan Freeman took a chance on a man the world had already condemned. Today, at the grand opening of a new education center, that same man steps to the stage, and what he reveals about their quiet act of faith leaves the entire room frozen in silence. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The morning light over Los Angeles spilled through the tall glass windows of Keanu Reeves' kitchen, catching the faint steam rising from his coffee. The city was quiet, unusually so, wrapped in that fragile calm that comes before the noise of the day. He stood by the counter, still in a black t-shirt and jeans, when the knock came at his door. It wasn't the usual delivery driver or fan mail. This envelope was different, cream-colored, embossed, addressed in careful handwriting that seemed familiar, yet distant. He turned it over once, twice, sensing something personal about it. The return address read, Phoenix Life Center. He frowned slightly. That name stirred something in the back of his mind, a flicker of memory he couldn't yet place. He carried the envelope to the table, sat down, and slid a finger under the seal. Inside was a formal printed invitation with golden lettering. You are cordially invited to the grand opening of the Phoenix Life Center for Reintegration and Education. Below the official text, there was a smaller, handwritten note on plain white paper. The ink looked rushed, uneven, but heartfelt. It read, 10 years ago you believed in me. I hope you'll see what your kindness created. Keanu stared at the words, unmoving. His mind replayed faces from a decade ago, men sitting in folding chairs in a dim room, eyes down, hands trembling as they tried to speak about the lives they had lost. A program he and Morgan Freeman had joined years earlier came back to him, one that helped former inmates re-enter society. It had been a quiet chapter in his life, not one he'd ever spoken about publicly. He had met dozens of men there, all carrying their own ghosts. He picked up the note again, tracing the ink with his thumb. Something about the tone, humble but proud, caught him. Whoever had written this wasn't just thanking him. It was an invitation to witness transformation. His phone buzzed on the table. Morgan's name flashed on the screen. Keanu answered softly. "Morning, Morgan." "Morning, brother," Morgan said, his voice deep and warm. "You sound like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," Keanu replied. "I just got a letter. It's from a place called the Phoenix Life Center." There was a pause on the line. Then Morgan's tone shifted slightly. "Phoenix, huh? You mean the one in Fresno?" "I think so," Keanu said, glancing at the letter again. "They're having a grand opening. The note says, 10 years ago, you believed in me. Sounds like someone from that reintegration program." Morgan chuckled, a soft, knowing sound. "Well, now that's something. Guess one of those young men finally made it out for good." "Yeah," Keanu murmured. "But the question is, which one?" The silence stretched between them, filled with mutual reflection. Both of them had spent that year visiting correctional facilities and halfway houses, speaking to groups of men who were trying to find new footing after prison. It wasn't glamorous work, and it hadn't been about publicity. It had been about humanity. Finally, Morgan said, "Why don't we meet up? I know a place that still makes real coffee, not that machine stuff you drink." Keanu smiled faintly. "All right, I'll bring the letter." 2 hours later, they were sitting at a quiet corner table in a small cafe tucked off Sunset Boulevard. The place was almost empty. Just a few early patrons, and the smell of toasted bread drifting through the air. Morgan arrived wearing a light gray hat and sunglasses, the kind of subtle disguise that fooled no one but made him feel comfortable. Keanu had the letter folded neatly in his jacket pocket. He slid it across the table. Morgan adjusted his glasses, reading every word slowly. When he reached the handwritten note, he exhaled through his nose. "Well, I'll be damned," he said softly. "You remember how rough those sessions were? Some of those men didn't even know how to look people in the eye anymore. "I remember," Keanu said. "Most of them were scared of themselves more than the world." Morgan leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "It's funny, isn't it? You think you're the one giving hope, but really, it's them giving it back to you." I still remember the guy who fixed the light in that old workshop. He had those trembling hands, but he kept saying, "Just give me a reason to try again." Morgan tapped the letter gently. "Maybe this is him." "Maybe," Keanu said, looking out the window. "Or maybe it's someone we've both forgotten. Someone who finally found his way back." The morning crowd began to trickle in, but the two men barely noticed. There was something unspoken between them, a shared sense of wonder at the power of time. Keanu folded the letter back into his jacket and said, "You think we should go?" Morgan's lips curved into a slow smile. "Brother, when a man writes something like that, you don't ignore it. We're going." Keanu nodded, finishing his coffee in silence. For a moment, the noise of the cafe faded into nothing. He thought about all those faces from 10 years ago, all those men trying to rebuild what life had taken apart. Somewhere out there, one of them had built something new, something worth seeing. He didn't know what waited for him at the Phoenix Life Center, but one thing was certain. Whoever had written that letter still carried his words from a decade ago. And now, it was time to find out what those words had become. The next morning, Keanu sat by his window, the letter still on the table beside him. The city below was already alive with movement cars rushing, voices blending into the hum of a busy day. But his thoughts were elsewhere. He kept rereading the note, feeling the weight of every word. It wasn't just gratitude, it was a quiet challenge. He remembered the first time he walked into that rehabilitation center a decade ago. The air had smelled like stale paint and disinfectant, the walls lined with men who looked like they had already given up on life. Yet Morgan's calm voice and steady humor had somehow lifted the room. Keanu had followed his lead, unsure if his presence made any difference at all. Now, years later, it seemed one of those men hadn't forgotten. Someone had carried that small light of belief for 10 long years and turned it into something real. Keanu felt a strange mixture of pride and humility. Maybe Morgan was right. Sometimes hope was a seed you didn't know you planted until it grew. He looked at the date on the invitation. The opening was just 3 days away. Without hesitation, he picked up his phone and called Morgan again. "Still up for that road trip?" he asked. Morgan laughed softly on the other end. "Wouldn't miss it for the world. Let's see what kind of miracle our old friend built." Keanu smiled, sliding the letter into his travel bag. For the first time in years, he felt anticipation not for a film or a premiere, but for a reunion born out of faith, time, and redemption. He didn't yet know it, but the journey ahead would remind him why quiet kindness was never forgotten. That evening, Keanu stopped by Morgan's home in the Hollywood Hills. The sunset painted the sky in deep gold, the city below glowing like embers. Morgan was on the porch, sipping tea, his expression calm but thoughtful. When Keanu stepped out of his car, Morgan greeted him with that familiar half-smile. "So," Morgan said, lifting his cup, "you ready to see what our past turned into?" Keanu sat beside him, pulling the invitation from his jacket. "It's strange," he admitted. "I don't remember their faces clearly anymore. Just moments, bits of laughter, quiet talks, hands trying to build something from nothing." Morgan nodded. "You don't always need to remember their faces, brother. You remember the hope. That's what matters." Keanu stared out toward the skyline. "I wonder who wrote that note." It felt personal, like someone who really struggled, but didn't let it define him. Morgan leaned forward. "Then that's exactly who we're going to meet. A man who refused to stay broken." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that only longtime friends share. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint hum of traffic from below. Keanu looked at the letter one more time, reading those words again. "You believed in me." He folded it carefully and said, "It's easy to forget how far a simple belief can go." Morgan smiled faintly. "Then let's go find out just how far it went." The two men stood, the quiet weight of purpose between them. Tomorrow, they would drive north, back toward a place that held both memory and meaning. Neither of them could have imagined that the letter on Keanu's table would soon lead them to one of the most powerful reunions of their lives. 10 years earlier, the air inside the old community center on the edge of downtown Los Angeles carried a mix of sawdust, sweat, and cautious hope. The building had once been a high school gym, but now served as a halfway house for men recently released from prison. The walls were scuffed, the floors uneven, and the light flickered in the corners, but it was a place where broken lives were learning to rebuild. Keanu Reeves and Morgan Freeman walked in, quietly, both wearing simple work clothes. There were no cameras, no reporters, no press release announcing their visit. They were there as volunteers, mentors in a new reintegration initiative that connected Hollywood set-building crews with former inmates looking for a trade. The program's director, a middle-aged social worker named Clara Hill, introduced them to the group of 12 men sitting in folding chairs. Their faces told stories of pain, regret, and survival. "Gentlemen," Clara said, her voice steady, "these two men are here to teach you skills that can get you back on your feet. Construction, design, teamwork. But more than that, they're here to remind you that the world hasn't forgotten you." A few of the men nodded politely. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Keanu scanned the room, his gaze settling on a tall man in the back. His arms were covered in faded tattoos, crosses, dates, names, and his eyes carried a depth of exhaustion that words couldn't touch. He looked like someone who hadn't smiled in years. When the introductions ended, Keanu walked over to him. "Hey," he said gently. "I'm Keanu." The man looked up slowly, his voice quiet but rough. "James," he replied. "James Porter." Keanu extended his hand. "Good to meet you, James." The handshake was hesitant but firm. Keanu could feel the tension behind it, the guardedness of someone who had learned to expect disappointment. Morgan approached next, his tone calm and measured. "Mr. Porter," he said with that unmistakable voice that carried authority without judgment, "you ever work with your hands before?" James shrugged. "Did some framing jobs before everything went wrong." Morgan nodded thoughtfully. "Then we'll build on that." As the morning went on, the men were divided into pairs. Keanu led a small workshop in the corner of the gym, showing how to measure, cut, and assemble basic wooden frames for film sets. He didn't talk much, preferring to let the work itself do the teaching. Morgan, meanwhile, sat with another group, discussing simple daily disciplines: how to plan your day, communicate without anger, keep commitments. By noon, the atmosphere began to change. The first few jokes slipped out among the group. Someone whistled along with the radio. Even James, who had been silent for most of the morning, began to ask questions. "How do you make sure the cut's straight?" he asked, watching Keanu guide the saw. Keanu smiled faintly. "Measure twice, cut once. My old mentor taught me that." James nodded, repeating it under his breath, like a lesson from another life. When the day ended, the men were tired, but engaged. Clara thanked everyone, but before leaving, Keanu looked back at James. Their eyes met for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of something beginning, though neither knew what yet. As they stepped outside into the fading sunlight, Morgan turned to Keanu. "What do wood? You think?" Keanu looked back at the building. "I think there's a lot of broken wood in there," he said softly. "But maybe we can still build something worth standing." Over the next several weeks, Keanu and Morgan became familiar faces at the halfway house. They arrived early, long before the men gathered, often setting up the tools and cleaning the dusty workbenches themselves. The place began to feel less like a rehabilitation center and more like a workshop of second chances. Each session started the same way. Morgan would speak first, standing in front of the men with his calm authority, sharing short stories about resilience. "You can't steer a parked car," he'd often say. "You have to start moving, even if you don't know where the road leads." Then Keanu would take over. Sleeves rolled up, showing the men how to handle drills, saws, and levels. He didn't talk much during lessons, but he listened to the small frustrations, the quiet sighs, the muttered doubts that hung between each cut of wood. James Porter kept mostly to himself. He showed up on time, worked quietly, and stayed late to clean up. But behind that quietness, Keanu sensed a storm. The man's eyes often lingered on the exits, as if haunted by places he couldn't return to. Sometimes he'd pause mid-task, staring at the grain of a plank like it held his entire past. One afternoon, during a break, Keanu sat beside him on the edge of a work table. "You're good at this," he said. James gave a dry laugh. "Good at breaking things, maybe. Building's new to me." Keanu shook his head. "You've got steady hands. You just don't trust them yet." For a long moment, James didn't answer. Then he said, "I used to build furniture with my dad. Before I got into drugs. Before everything fell apart." Keanu nodded quietly. "So it's not new. You're just remembering." James looked down, swallowing hard. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was heavy, but honest. Morgan watched from across the room, understanding what was happening without saying a word. He'd seen it before, the slow thaw of a man who had forgotten how to believe in himself. Later that day, when the others had gone, Morgan approached Keanu as he was packing up. "You've got a soft spot for that one," he said gently. Keanu shrugged. "He reminds me of someone I used to know. Someone who just needed someone to see him." Morgan smiled faintly. "Careful. You get too close, and you'll start carrying his burdens too." Keanu looked toward the window, where James was standing outside smoking alone. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. The weeks turned into months. James started volunteering to help others. He taught one of the younger men how to sand properly, corrected another on measurements. Slowly, his posture changed. Shoulders less hunched, steps more confident. Keanu noticed every small shift, every spark of progress. During one of their final sessions that year, Clara gathered everyone to thank them. "You've built more than walls and frames here," she said. "You've built a foundation for new lives." James didn't smile, but his eyes glistened. As the group dispersed, he walked up to Keanu and Morgan. "You two didn't have to come here," he said softly. "Most people wouldn't." Morgan looked at him and replied, "Most people forget that prison isn't the end. It's just one of the roads back." James nodded, his voice cracking. "I don't know where mine leads yet." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "Forward," he said simply. That word stayed with James long after the lights in the workshop went dark. By the end of the year, the program had become part of their rhythm every Thursday. Same time, same faces. But something about that final day felt different. The air was colder, the light dimmer, and the men seemed quieter, aware that this chapter was ending. Clara gathered everyone together for a closing reflection. Morgan spoke first, his voice steady and rich, echoing off the old gym walls. "You've each carried weight most men wouldn't survive," he said. "But strength isn't about never falling. It's about standing up when the world expects you to stay down." The room fell silent. Keanu stepped forward, glancing at the small wooden bench James had built over the weeks. "Every piece of this was made by hands that once hurt, now healed," he said softly. "That's something to be proud of." When class dismissed, James lingered behind. He stood near the bench, tracing the edges with his fingers. Keanu approached, sensing the hesitation in his stance. "I don't know what's next," James admitted. "Feels like when I walk out that door, everything I've built here disappears." Keanu looked at him carefully. "It doesn't disappear. It goes with you. The work you've done here, it's not just wood and nails. It's proof. You can build again." James nodded slowly, eyes glistening. He didn't say goodbye, just extended his hand. Stronger this time. Steady. Keanu gripped it firmly, sensing this was more than gratitude, it was a promise. As Keanu and Morgan left the center that night, Morgan glanced back at the lights, shutting off one by one. "You think we'll ever see him again?" he asked. Keanu exhaled softly. "If he finds his way," he said, "we won't have to look. He'll show us." The days grew shorter as winter settled over Los Angeles, and the old gym where the workshops were held grew colder at night. Most of the men rushed out after class, eager to catch buses or make curfew at their halfway homes. But one evening, Keanu noticed James still sitting at his workbench long after everyone else had gone. The only sound was the soft hum of the old fluorescent lights and the faint scrape of sandpaper as James smoothed the edge of a wooden stool he'd been building for weeks. Keanu walked over quietly, pulling up a chair beside him. "You know, you don't have to stay this late," he said. James didn't look up. "Can't sleep much," he muttered. "Too many memories when it gets quiet." Keanu leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "That's when they're loudest, huh?" James stopped sanding, his hand tightening around the block of wood. "You ever mess up so bad that even silence feels like punishment?" Keanu didn't answer right. "Away. I've made mistakes," he said softly. "Different ones, maybe. But I know what it's like to live with things you can't fix." James sighed, finally meeting his eyes. "I was 22 when I first got high. Thought it made me fearless. Within a year, I was stealing to feed the habit. One night, I hit a store. Didn't even realize the clerk was a friend of my father's until it was too late. That's the night everything fell apart." He paused, his jaw trembling slightly. "I spent 7 years in prison. My daughter was 3 when I went in. She stopped visiting after the first year. Her mother told her I was gone. Guess that was easier than telling her who I became." Keanu sat quietly, letting the weight of the words settle between them. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. James continued, voice low and cracked. "People say you pay your debt when you serve your time. But that's a lie. You come out owing the world something you can't ever repay." Keanu looked at the stool James was sanding. "You're paying it," he said quietly. "Every time you show up, every time you help someone here, you're building again." James laughed bitterly. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't," Keanu replied. "You can't rewrite the past, James, but you can reframe what it means." James looked at him, confused. Keanu continued, "Maybe your story isn't about the robbery. Maybe it's about what you do after it. Maybe the past is just the foundation for who you become." The silence stretched again, but this time it was softer. James nodded slowly, like he was hearing something new for the first time. "Why do you care so much?" he asked quietly. Keanu hesitated before answering. "Because someone once cared enough to believe I could be more than my worst day." James didn't speak again, but something shifted in his expression. The shame didn't vanish, but the heaviness in his shoulders eased, slightly. He went back to sanding the stool, slower this time, more deliberate. Keanu stayed beside him until the lights flickered off. When they finally walked out together into the cold air, James said, almost to himself, "Maybe that's enough for now." The days grew shorter as winter settled over Los Angeles, and the old gym where the workshops were held grew colder at night. Most of the men rushed out after class, eager to catch buses or make curfew at their halfway homes. But one evening, Keanu noticed James still sitting at his workbench long after everyone else had gone. The only sound was the soft hum of the old fluorescent lights and the faint scrape of sandpaper as James smoothed the edge of a wooden stool he'd been building for weeks. Keanu walked over quietly, pulling up a chair beside him. "You know, you don't have to stay this late," he said. James didn't look up. "Can't sleep much," he muttered. "Too many memories when it gets quiet." Keanu leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "That's when they're loudest, huh?" James stopped sanding, his hand tightening around the block of wood. "You ever mess up so bad that even silence feels like punishment?" Keanu didn't answer right away. "I've made mistakes," he said softly. "Different ones, maybe. But I know what it's like to live with things you can't fix." James sighed, finally meeting his eyes. "I was 22 when I first got high. Thought it made me fearless. Within a year, I was stealing to feed the habit. One night, I hit a store. Didn't even realize the clerk was a friend of my father's until it was too late. That's the night everything fell apart." He paused, his jaw trembling slightly. "I spent 7 years in prison. My daughter was 3 when I went in. She stopped visiting after the first year. Her mother told her I was gone. Guess that was easier than telling her who I became." Keanu sat quietly, letting the weight of the words settle between them. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. James continued, voice low and cracked. "People say you pay your debt when you serve your time, but that's a lie. You come out owing the world something you can't ever repay." Keanu looked at the stool James was sanding. "You're paying it," he said quietly. "Every time you show up, every time you help someone here, you're building again." James laughed bitterly. "You make it sound simple." "It isn't," Keanu replied. "You can't rewrite the past, James, but you can reframe what it means." James looked at him, confused. Keanu continued, "Maybe your story isn't about the robbery. Maybe it's about what you do after it. Maybe the past is just the foundation for who you become." The silence stretched again, but this time it was softer. James nodded slowly, like he was hearing something new for the first time. "Why do you care so much?" he asked, quietly. Keanu hesitated before answering. "Because someone once cared enough to believe I could be more than my worst day." James didn't speak again, but something shifted in his expression. The shame didn't vanish, but the heaviness in his shoulders eased slightly. He went back to sanding the stool, slower this time, more deliberate. Keanu stayed beside him until the lights flickered off. When they finally walked out together into the cold air, James said, almost to himself, "Maybe that's enough for now." The following week, the transformation was unmistakable. James was no longer the quiet man sitting at the back of the class. He was the first to arrive, the last to leave, and the one who now offered encouragement to others. When a new group of men joined the program, he greeted them at the door, helping them sign in and find tools. It was as if the same man who once looked for a reason to disappear now searched for reasons to stay. One evening, Keanu noticed James, standing by the doorway after everyone had gone. He looked tired, but at peace, staring at the stool he had finished weeks ago. "You know," Keanu said softly, stepping beside him, "it's solid. Doesn't wobble, doesn't crack. You built it right." James nodded, his eyes fixed on the stool. "It's strange. I used to think I couldn't make anything that would last. Not relationships, not work, not even trust. Everything I touched broke." Keanu looked at him thoughtfully. "Maybe this is where that changes. Maybe now you build things that hold." James smiled faintly. "You really think I can?" "I don't think," Keanu said quietly. "I know." The room was silent for a long time. The faint sound of a hammer clinking against a table echoed in the distance. James finally exhaled and said, "Then I'll keep building, even if it takes the rest of my life." A few days later, Clara announced that one of the men from the program had been hired by a small film, a studio. The class erupted in cheers, but James just sat back, smiling quietly. When Keanu asked why he wasn't celebrating, James replied, "Because now I know it's possible for him, for me, for anyone who doesn't give up." Morgan overheard and smiled. "That's all we ever wanted you to see." The session ended, but that moment stayed. For the first time since leaving prison, James felt like his life was moving forward, not out of guilt or obligation, but from a real sense of purpose. He began to stand taller, laugh a little more, and look people in the eye. The man who once hid behind silence had started to rebuild himself from the inside out. Spring came early that year, and with it came an unexpected opportunity. Keanu had been reading through a few small independent film proposals when a message caught his eye. It was from an old friend, a director named Alan Russo, who was preparing a low-budget film about redemption and community. Alan was looking for crew, members who could handle long hours and physical work. He wrote, "We need people who care more about purpose than fame." Keanu thought immediately of James Porter. The man had been consistent for months, punctual, steady, patient. He had rebuilt his reputation within the reintegration program and had become someone others looked up to. Still, Keanu knew how difficult it could be for a man with a record to get a job, especially in a world as skeptical as the film industry. That afternoon, Keanu visited the halfway center, catching James while he was repairing one of the workshop benches. "James," he said, "I might have something for you." James looked up, wiping his hands on a rag. "A job?" "Yeah," Keanu replied. "Film crew work. It's tough, long hours, but honest pay and good people. I can recommend you to the director." James froze. "They'll check my record," he said quietly. "Once they see that, I'm done before I start." Keanu's voice stayed calm. "Then I'll talk to them. Let me handle that part. You just show up and do what you do best." The next morning, Keanu called Alan. They spoke for nearly an hour. Alan hesitated at first, uncertain about hiring a former inmate. But Keanu's tone was steady, his conviction clear. "I'm vouching for him," he said. "If he fails, that's on me. But he won't. Give him a chance. You won't regret it." There was silence on the other end. Then, Alan finally sighed. "All right, Keanu. Send him in." When Keanu told James the news, he stood still for a moment, almost unable to process it. "You really did that? You put your name on the line for me?" Keanu smiled faintly. "You earned that. Now go prove it." James spent the night ironing his one clean shirt and writing a list of things to remember. Arrive early. Listen carefully. Don't lose your temper. Thank everyone. It wasn't just a job interview. It felt like the beginning of a new life. When he walked onto the small film set 2 days later, he was nervous but focused. The director gave him a quick tour, introducing him to the crew, who gave polite but guarded nods. James could feel the unspoken skepticism in the air. Still, he set down his bag and got to work, silently determined to let his actions speak louder than his past. By the end of the first day, he had fixed a jammed dolly track, organized the lighting cables, and stayed 2 hours after wrap to clean up the stage. When Alan passed by, he said quietly to Keanu, "That guy doesn't stop working." Keanu only smiled. "I told you." That night, as James left the studio, the security guard at the gate nodded and said, "Good work today." For the first time in years, James felt a small but powerful thing belonging. The following weeks became a test of endurance for James. The work was long, physical, and often thankless, hauling cables, moving heavy lights, sweeping stages after everyone had gone home. But he never complained. Each day he arrived before dawn and left after dark, determined to prove himself. His hands grew rough and calloused again. But this time, they built rather than destroyed. One evening, The gaffer injured his back, leaving the lighting team short-staffed. James volunteered to help, despite not having formal training. He listened closely, learned fast, and within a few hours was climbing ladders and adjusting rigs with the precision of someone who had done it for years. When the director walked by and saw him balancing 20 feet above the ground with perfect focus, he turned to Keanu and whispered, "You weren't kidding." "He works like he's got something to make right." Keanu smiled faintly. "He does, and he's doing it." Morgan Freeman dropped by the set a few days later to visit Keanu. The production was shooting in an old warehouse converted into a soundstage, the kind of place that carried both grit and soul. Morgan watched quietly from a distance as James coordinated the lighting cues with the camera crew. His movements were confident, his instructions clear. There was no trace of the broken man they had met months before. When the scene wrapped, Keanu brought Morgan over. "James," he said, "look who stopped by." James turned and froze for a moment, then broke into a broad smile. "Mr. Freeman," he said, shaking his hand firmly. "Didn't think I'd see you here again." Morgan looked him over with pride. "I had to see it with my own eyes," he said. "Last time I saw you, you could barely hold a hammer. Now look at you running lights for a film crew." James laughed softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess I finally found my rhythm." "You didn't find it, son. You built it." Later that evening, as the crew took a break, Keanu and Morgan sat on the edge of the set, watching James work. He was adjusting a reflector, instructing another worker with quiet patience. Morgan leaned toward Keanu. "You know," he said, "you've done good here. Not many people stick around long enough to see redemption come full circle." Keanu shook his head slowly. "He did this, not me. All I did was open the door." Morgan's smile widened. "And sometimes that's all a man needs. One open door, one person who doesn't look away." By the end of the week, James had become indispensable. The crew trusted him, the director relied on him, and the set ran smoother because of him. When payroll came, Alan personally handed James his check. "You've earned this," he said. "And for the record, I don't care what your past looks like. You're part of the team now." James stood speechless for a moment, then nodded, gripping the envelope tightly. For the first time since prison, he wasn't defined by what he'd done, but by what he'd become. That night, he sat in his small apartment staring at the check, not because of the money, but because it symbolized something far greater: trust restored. A week later, filming wrapped for the season. The crew decided to meet at a small diner near the studio, the kind of place with faded leather booths and black and white photos of old movie stars on the walls. Keanu, Morgan, and James sat together in the corner, away from the noise of laughter and clinking coffee cups. James had cleaned up after his last day on set, wearing a simple button-up shirt. His hands were still rough, but they looked strong, capable. He stared at his coffee for a long time before finally saying, "I don't know how to thank you both. You didn't just give me a job. You gave me a reason to stand tall again." Morgan leaned back with that knowing smile. "We didn't give you anything you didn't already have. You just needed to see it again." James nodded slowly, emotion tightening his throat. "You two made me feel like a man again." Keanu's eyes softened. "You did that yourself," he said. "We just reminded you who you were." The three men sat in silence for a moment, the kind that carried more meaning than words ever could. Outside, the neon sign flickered, casting soft red light across their faces. For James, it was more than a meal. It was closure. The moment he realized that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but owning it, transforming it. When they left the diner, the night air was cool and still. James turned to the two men who had once been strangers and now felt like family. "I'll keep going," he said quietly. "I promise." Keanu nodded, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Then we'll see where the road takes you next." Time moved quietly after that night at the diner. The world spun forward, as it always does. carrying each of them toward new chapters. Keanu went back to his usual rhythm film sets, interviews, and long stretches of quiet in between. Yet every so often, he thought about James Porter. He'd catch himself wondering where he'd gone, whether the job on that small film had led to something more, or if life had pulled him back into the shadows he had worked so hard to escape. Years passed, and though Keanu never heard from James again, the man's story lived in him. During interviews, when journalists asked about his humanitarian work, he would sometimes pause before answering. Then he'd say something like, "I once met someone who reminded me that a single moment of belief can outlast years of doubt." It was his quiet way of honoring the memory without naming names. Morgan Freeman carried that memory too. In his speeches, he often referenced the experience, calling it one of the most meaningful things he'd ever been part of. At a film gala one night, under the soft glow of chandeliers and applause, Morgan told the audience, "You never know whose life you're holding in your hands. When you choose kindness, it could be the moment that changes everything for them and for you." The room went still. People clapped politely, but those who knew Morgan well saw something real behind his words. Meanwhile, James's life had taken its own winding path. After the film wrapped, he found work in construction, starting as a laborer on small housing projects. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. He kept his head down, saved every dollar he could, and tried to live by the lessons he'd learned in that workshop years ago: measure twice, cut once, and never rush what needs care. He lived in a small rented apartment near the outskirts of Bakersfield, where rent was low and work was consistent. On weekends, he volunteered to repair fences and patch roofs for local families who couldn't afford contractors. Nobody knew much about his past, and he preferred it that way. He had stopped explaining himself years ago. At night, when the world went quiet, James would take out a worn notebook and write. He wrote letters he never sent to his daughter, to his late father, to himself. The words were always the same: apologies, promises, and prayers. "I'm still trying," he'd write. "I don't know if you'd recognize me now, but I'm still trying." He had a small box under his bed filled with these letters, along with a single photo, a faded picture of a little girl with curly hair sitting on his shoulders. Her smile looked like sunlight. He'd taken that picture before everything fell apart. Every night he'd stare at it and whisper, "One day I'll be worthy to see you again." As the years continued, James Porter learned how to live quietly. He rented a small studio above a mechanic's shop, the kind of place that always smelled faintly of oil and dust. But he didn't mind. It was a far cry from the cold walls of prison or the halfway house that once held his freedom at arm's length. Here, he had something he hadn't felt in years: control over his own life. Every morning he woke before sunrise, made coffee in an old metal pot, and walked to the job site carrying a lunch he packed himself. The foreman soon noticed that James worked harder and complained less than anyone else. When a new hire showed up, James was the first to help him learn the ropes. Word spread through the local trade circle. If you needed a reliable man, call James Porter. But behind the steadiness, there was still an ache, a quiet longing that never left. On his breaks, James often found himself watching families walk past the construction site. Fathers with children, laughing together, carrying groceries, sharing little moments he'd forfeited long ago. He would look down at his calloused hands and think, 100 houses, but you can't rebuild time. He enrolled in night classes at a community college, studying carpentry and basic business management. He sat among students half his age, listening more than he spoke, trying to absorb everything he could. His teachers admired his discipline. He stayed late to ask questions and turned every assignment into something practical. In one class, he built a model of a small community center and titled it the Phoenix Project. He didn't tell anyone that the name came from the program where Keanu and Morgan had once believed in him. To him, the word symbolized rebirth, what it meant to rise after burning. His life took on a rhythm: work, study, write, repeat, Sometimes he would walk home late under the streetlights, his boots dragging on the cracked sidewalk, humming to himself just to break the silence. He had no one waiting for him at home, but he carried hope like a fragile ember in his chest, keeping it alive through the small things an honest day's work. A letter written by lamplight, a memory of two men who refused to give up on him. One summer, he drove past a billboard for a new film starring Keanu Reeves. The image of the actor brought an involuntary smile to his face. It wasn't envy or sadness, just quiet gratitude. He parked his old truck on the shoulder and whispered to the empty air, "You kept your word, man. I did too." That night, he returned home and pulled out the photograph of his daughter again. She was probably grown now, maybe in college. He didn't know where she lived or what her life looked like, but he still whispered to her photo every night, "I'm almost there. I'm getting closer." The seasons came and went, and with them, the lines on James Porter's face deepened not from age alone, but from years of quiet perseverance. His hair began to gray at the temples, yet there was peace in the man he had become. The ghosts that once haunted his nights had softened into lessons. The shame that once silenced him had turned into purpose. By his late 40s, he had saved enough to buy a used pickup truck and a small patch of land outside Fresno. There he built a modest workshop by hand. The smell of sawdust and varnish filled the air as he began taking small commissions, building furniture, repairing old tools, crafting things that would last. On the wall of that workshop, he hung a small piece of wood etched with a phrase Keanu had once told him, "You can't rewrite the past, but you can reframe what it means." He lived simply, working through the days and reading at night. On weekends, he volunteered to teach woodworking at a local youth center. Many of the boys there came from rough neighborhoods, some already brushing up against the edges of trouble. James saw himself in their uncertainty, their anger, and their hunger to be seen. He never told them about his past, not directly. But his lessons always carried a deeper message. The wood doesn't care where you came from, he'd say. It only cares how steady your hands are when you work. The kids listened. They liked him. They called him Mr. Porter. And he carried that title with pride. Still, there were nights when he'd sit alone in that workshop, staring at the photo of his daughter, her face frozen in time. He had tried searching for her once, only to discover that her mother had remarried and moved out of state. She was living a good life college, a job, a future untouched by the chaos he had once created. James didn't want to disturb that peace. Not yet. Instead, he kept writing. Each year, on her birthday, he wrote a new letter and placed it in the box beneath his bed. Each one began the same way. "Dear Emily, I'm still here. I hope you are too." One night, under the hum of a single lamp, he placed his pen down and whispered to the photograph, "I'm not ready to see you yet, but I'm working toward it. I want to be the kind of man you'd be proud to meet." He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the box. Then he turned off the light, walked to the door, and looked out at the stars. Somewhere in that vast sky, he felt a faint connection to the people who had believed in him long ago. Keanu, Morgan, and a daughter he still hoped to hold again. The morning sun shimmered over the rolling hills of Central California as Keanu Reeves guided his black SUV down a quiet two-lane highway. Morgan Freeman sat in the passenger seat, wearing a light gray fedora and a calm expression that carried both wisdom and quiet anticipation. The letter, the same one that had arrived weeks earlier, rested on the dashboard between them. Neither man spoke for a while. The open road stretched ahead like an unwritten page. They had been driving for several hours, passing through small towns and golden fields that seemed untouched by time. Finally, a sign appeared on the roadside. "Welcome to Fairview, home of the past. Phoenix Life Center." Keanu slowed the car, reading the words aloud. Morgan tilted his head slightly. smiling. "Phoenix," he said softly. "Fitting name, isn't it?" Rising from the ashes. As they approached the town square, they noticed clusters of people gathered along the sidewalks. Dressed in their Sunday best, some carried banners that read, "Celebrating Second Chances." The air felt charged with excitement, the kind of energy that comes from hope reborn. At the heart of the square stood a modern glass and brick building gleaming in the sunlight. The letters above the entrance were large and simple: the Phoenix Life Center, Education, and Reintegration. Keanu parked nearby. For a moment, he just sat behind the wheel, staring at the building. It was new, bold, full of life. 10 years, he murmured, almost to himself. And look what's grown from it. Morgan opened his door, the warm air rushing in. "Come on," he said, his tone carrying a hint of awe. "Let's see what kind of miracle we walked into." As they stepped out, several people recognized them. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but it wasn't the frenzied excitement of fans. It was respect. These weren't people meeting movie stars. They were meeting mentors. A woman in her 40s approached with a smile, wearing a volunteer badge. "Mr. Reeves. Mr. Freeman, welcome. We've been expecting you." Keanu shook her hand warmly. "Thank you for inviting us. This place, it's beautiful." She nodded proudly. "It's more than a building. It's a promise kept." They followed her through the front doors into a spacious lobby filled with light. The walls were lined with framed photographs, smiling graduates, mentors, and volunteers. There were certificates, newspaper clippings, and a large mural that read, "Every life can rise again." As they walked slowly down the hallway, Keanu's eyes were drawn to one photograph in particular. It was old, slightly faded, showing him standing beside a young man shaking his hand in the workshop from 10 years ago. The man's face was familiar, sharper jawline, tired eyes, but unmistakable. Keanu stopped in his tracks. "That's James," he whispered. Morgan turned to look. His expression softened immediately. "Well, I'll be," he said quietly. "He made it." The volunteer stopped beside them, noticing their focus. "Oh, you know James?" Keanu nodded, his voice low but steady. "We do. We worked with him years ago." She smiled gently. "Then you're going to love this part. He's not just part of the program anymore. He runs it. James Porter is our executive director." Keanu froze for a heartbeat, the words sinking in. Morgan's smile widened, full of pride. "I told you," he said, patting Keanu's shoulder. "Sometimes the seeds we plant take a while to bloom." Keanu's eyes lingered on the photo. The young man in it had once been lost, fragile, uncertain. Now, that same man was leading others out of the dark. Something inside Keanu stirred a deep, quiet gratitude that words couldn't express. The volunteer led Keanu and Morgan down a hallway that opened into a large multi-purpose room filled with people. Tables were lined with crafts, woodworking tools, and framed certificates from recent graduates of the reintegration program. The hum of conversation filled the air, laughter, greetings, and warm reunions between men who had rebuilt their lives through the center. A few former inmates recognized Keanu and Morgan, approaching them with hesitant smiles. One man, dressed in a clean work shirt, said, "You probably don't remember me, but I was in that first group you mentored in Los Angeles. You showed us how to make frames for stage sets. Now I teach high school shop class." Keanu's face broke into a smile. "I do remember," he said sincerely, shaking his hand. "You stayed behind after class once to fix a broken hinge. You said you wanted to understand how things fit together." "I guess you still do." The man laughed softly. "Yeah, only now it's students instead of plywood." Morgan leaned in, his deep voice calm but warm. "And that's how legacy works, son. You pass it on." The man nodded, pride shining in his eyes. He excused himself as the volunteer motioned toward the stage area where a group of staff were preparing for the ceremony. Keanu and Morgan took their seats in the second row, near a display table that featured the history of the Phoenix Life Center. There were old photographs from its founding, construction crews, volunteers, and small groups of men in recovery programs. Then, tucked near the center of the display, Keanu spotted another framed image that stopped him cold. It was a blueprint, hand-drawn, labeled The Phoenix Project. The name was scrawled in the corner, familiar handwriting in bold strokes. James Porter. Morgan followed his gaze, eyes narrowing with recognition. He named it after his dream, he said softly. The same name he talked about years ago. Keanu smiled, a slow, proud smile. He didn't just rise from the ashes, he built wings. The ceremony began with applause as the mayor stepped up to the microphone, speaking about the impact the center had on the local community. He talked about the reduction in recidivism, the hundreds of graduates who had found stable work, and the ripple of hope spreading through the county. But Keanu barely heard the words. His mind was fixed on one thought, James. As the applause faded, the host announced, "We're honored today to welcome two men whose compassion and belief in this program's early years helped shape its foundation, Mr. Keanu Reeves and Mr. Morgan Freeman." The audience erupted in cheers. Keanu and Morgan stood humbly, nodding in acknowledgement. Keanu gave a small wave, feeling a mix of warmth and disbelief. He hadn't come here for recognition, but for understanding. When they sat down, Morgan leaned closer and said, "You know what I love about all this? Not one of these people cares about who we are. They care about what we stood for." Keanu nodded, emotion in his eyes. "That's the best kind of fame, isn't it?" Before Morgan could reply, the host continued. And now, to tell his story, the man whose journey began with a second chance and turned into a movement. Please welcome our executive director, Mr. James Porter. The audience burst into applause. Keanu's hands froze mid-clap, his eyes fixed on the side of the stage. A tall figure in a tailored gray suit emerged, his once tattooed arms now faintly visible beneath the cuffs. His hair had streaks of gray, but his posture was proud. It was James. James stepped to the podium, his expression calm but full of quiet emotion. The applause faded as he adjusted the microphone. For a moment, he looked over the crowd, hundreds of faces, some familiar, some new. Then his eyes found Keanu and Morgan in the second row. He froze for a heartbeat, his lips parting slightly in disbelief. A faint smile touched his face, one of deep gratitude rather than surprise. 10 years ago, he began, his voice steady. I was standing in a workshop, covered in sawdust, trying to remember what it felt like to be human. Two men I barely knew showed up week after week, not to preach, not to judge, but to remind us that broken things can still be built again. The room was silent, except for the soft creak of chairs as people leaned forward. James continued, They told me something that stayed with me ever since. They said, you can't rewrite the past, but you can reframe what it means. That line changed everything for me. He paused, glancing at Keanu, his eyes glassy. Because when the world gave up on me, they didn't. Keanu's throat tightened. Morgan placed a hand on his shoulder, his eyes glistening too. James's tone deepened. The Phoenix Life Center exists because of that belief that people can rise again, no matter how far they've fallen. I'm living proof of that. The crowd erupted in applause. James took a step back from the podium, emotion finally breaking through his calm. His voice cracked as he added, Mr. Reeves, Mr. Freeman, welcome home. Keanu rose slowly to his feet, clapping through the tears in his eyes. Morgan followed beside him, nodding with quiet pride as the room rose to its feet in a standing ovation. The room settled into silence after the thunderous applause faded. The sound of chairs creaking and whispers dying down filled the vast hall. At the front of the stage stood a modest wooden podium adorned with the Phoenix Life Center logo, a rising bird carved into a piece of reclaimed oak. The symbolism wasn't lost on Keanu. Every fiber of the room carried the essence of renewal. A local pastor, Reverend Harris, stepped forward to open the ceremony. His presence was calm and warm, his voice measured with the tone of someone who had seen both failure and redemption in human nature. "We gather here today," he began, "not to celebrate perfection, but progress. Not to honor the absence of mistakes, but the courage it takes to rise after them." He paused, scanning the audience, former inmates, their families, teachers, volunteers, and city officials. For too long, our system has punished without teaching. It has confined without guiding. But this place, this center represents something different. It believes that the heart can heal if given the right tools, that a man's worth isn't defined by his worst moment, but by what he chooses to do after. Morgan leaned slightly toward Keanu and whispered, This is what real reform looks like." Keanu nodded slowly, eyes focused on the pastor. "Yeah, and it started with one man believing he still could change." The pastor concluded his remarks with a prayer for hope and perseverance. As he stepped aside, the host took the microphone. "Thank you, Reverend Harris. And now it's my great honor to introduce the man whose leadership and courage brought the Phoenix Life Center to life. A man whose own story embodies the spirit of this place. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our Executive Director, Mr. James Porter." The applause began softly, then grew into a wave of sound that filled the room. Keanu felt his breath catch. For a moment, the years seemed to collapse the attester, workshop, the sawdust, the broken stool, the hesitant smile. All of it converged into this moment. From the side of the stage, James appeared. His suit was simple but sharp, his tie neatly knotted. The tattoos that once marked his arms were mostly hidden, but traces remained, like faint echoes of another life. His hair, streaked with silver, caught the light as he walked to the podium with calm confidence. Keanu couldn't stop smiling. "That's him," he whispered to Morgan, his voice full of quiet pride. "He's really here," Morgan grinned. "He's more than here, Keanu. He's standing on the mountain he built." James reached the podium, adjusting the microphone slightly. For a second, he stood still, looking over the crowd. The room waited. Then he spoke, his voice deep, controlled but threaded with emotion. 10 years ago, he began, I was a man defined by failure. My name was a cautionary tale. I didn't see light anywhere, not in the world, not in myself. And then, 2 men walked into a room full of people like me, people the world had already written off. They didn't come for praise. They came with open hands. His voice trembled slightly, but his gaze stayed steady. They didn't tell us what to be. They showed us what we could be. Keanu's throat tightened. He remembered that workshop. Those same words echoing between sawdust and silence. James's voice filled the hall now, stronger than it had ever been. James took a slow breath before continuing, his hands resting firmly on the podium. I remember the first time I met them, he said. I was sitting in the back of a room that smelled like paint and sawdust, just trying to get through another day without losing my temper. I didn't trust anyone back then. I didn't trust myself. But these 2 men, Mr. Reeves and Mr. Freeman, they didn't look at me like I was a criminal trying to fit into a world that no longer wanted me. They looked at me like I was a person who still mattered. A few murmurs of recognition moved through the crowd. Several men in the audience nodded slowly, knowing that same feeling of being seen after years of invisibility. James continued, his tone warm but unflinchingly honest. At first, I thought they were wasting their time. I told myself it was just another program, another chance for someone to check a box and say they helped. But then, I watched the way they showed up every single week. Mr. Reeves worked beside us like any other man, hammering, sanding, teaching us that precision takes patience. Mr. Freeman sat with us after class and talked about discipline, purpose, and forgiveness. He told us that wisdom doesn't erase pain, it redeems it. Morgan's eyes softened as he listened. He leaned toward Keanu, whispering quietly, "I don't even remember saying it like that." Keanu smiled faintly. He remembered because he needed to. James took a step back from the podium and looked down for a dawn, moment before raising his gaze again. Back then, I didn't understand what they were really doing. They weren't teaching us how to build furniture or film sets. They were teaching us how to rebuild ourselves, how to believe that a life shattered by bad choices could still have meaning. A hush filled the room. Even the faint rustle of the crowd stopped. James's tone grew heavier, his words deliberate. There's something about prison that takes more than your freedom. It takes your sense of worth. When you walk out, you think the world's forgotten you. Sometimes, you think it's better that way. But when someone, even one person, looks you in the eye and says, "You're not done yet," it can change everything. He looked toward Keanu and Morgan again, his voice breaking slightly. "Two men once told me I could start over. I didn't believe them then, but they refused to give up on me." Keanu lowered his head, emotions tightening in his chest. Morgan reached over and patted his arm gently. "That's what it's all about, brother," he whispered. "This right here." James continued, his tone steadying again. "The Phoenix Life Center began because I wanted others to feel that same truth. To know that redemption isn't something you earn, it's something you choose every day. We teach skills here, construction, design, education. But what we really teach is self-worth. You can build walls, but it's better to build bridges." Applause rippled through the audience. Quiet at first, then swelling. James nodded humbly, waiting for it to fade before adding, "When I walked into that workshop 10 years ago, I thought my life was over. Today, I stand here not as a man who was saved, but as a man who learned to save others." Morgan whispered under his breath, "He's preaching truth now." Keanu nodded, eyes glistening. "Yeah, and he earned every word." James paused at the podium, letting the applause die down. His eyes scanned the crowd, faces filled with pride, tears, and understanding. He smiled gently, then spoke again, quieter this time, almost reflective. "You know, people ask me sometimes what changed. How did I go from being an inmate to being the director of a place like this? And I tell them the truth, it wasn't luck. It wasn't a miracle. It was belief. Belief from two men who had nothing to gain by helping me." He turned his gaze toward Keanu and Morgan once more. "Mr. Reeves taught me something that stayed with me all these years. He said, 'You can't rewrite the past, but you can reframe what it means.' Back then, I didn't understand those words. I thought the past was a chain I'd wear forever. But over time, I realized he was right. The past isn't meant to crush us. It's meant to shape us into who we need to become." Keanu's eyes glistened as James continued. "I spent years building this center. Every wall, every classroom, every program is built on that. Belief that no life is beyond repair. The men who come through those doors don't need pity. They need tools. They need hope. They need someone to stand beside them and say, 'You still matter.'" The room was utterly silent now. Even the cameras stopped clicking. James took a deep breath, emotion filling his voice. "If I've learned one thing in this life, it's that redemption isn't loud. It's quiet. It happens in the small moments, the first honest day's work, the first apology, the first time someone calls you by your name instead of your mistake." He stepped back from the microphone and smiled through his tears. So if anyone here is wondering whether people can change, I'm standing here to tell you they can. I did. And I owe that truth to two men who refused to walk away. For a moment, the crowd didn't move. Then applause thundered through the hall, rising like a wave of gratitude and awe. Keanu and Morgan stood, clapping slowly at first, then with full hearts, as James Porter, the man they once saved, stood tall before the world he had rebuilt. The standing ovation seemed to shake the entire hall. People rose from their seats, clapping and cheering as James Porter stood at the podium, overwhelmed by emotion. The applause didn't die down, it grew louder, echoing through the walls of the Phoenix Life Center like a heartbeat. But amid the noise, James's gaze fixed on two faces in the front row. Keanu Reeves and Morgan Freeman stood together, clapping quietly, smiling through glistening eyes. For a brief moment, time stopped. James's composure faltered. His shoulders trembled, his throat tightened, and his voice, when it came, cracked with raw feeling. I didn't expect to see them here," he said, voice breaking. "Those two men down there? They're the reason any of this exists." The crowd slowly quieted. James's next words came softer. Each one carried on the weight of memory. 10 years ago, I was Pless, just another lost soul. But they saw something in me. I couldn't see myself. They showed up, week after week. They believed when I couldn't. His voice faltered again. He stepped away from the microphone, trying to steady his breath, but his emotions overpowered him. He descended the steps from the stage, the crowd parting as he walked down the aisle. Every footstep echoed in the stillness, the applause fading to a hush. Keanu and Morgan stood still, unsure what to expect. When James reached them, he didn't say a word at first. He simply opened his arms and pulled both men into a tight embrace. The crowd gasped softly, watching this moment unfold like something sacred. James's shoulders shook as tears streamed freely down his face. His voice came through in a trembling whisper. "If it weren't for you two believing in me when the whole world turned its back on me, I wouldn't be standing here today." Keanu's hand pressed gently on James's back, his own eyes wet. "You were always standing," he murmured. "You just needed to believe it." James pulled back slightly, looking between them, his face streaked with tears and pride. "You gave me more than a second chance," he said. "You gave me a reason to live." Morgan's voice, low and steady, broke the silence. "You see, Keanu," he said softly, "that's the only reward worth receiving." A murmur ran through the room as people began to rise again, slowly, reverently. Then, as if guided by one heartbeat, the entire audience stood and began to applaud, longer, louder, more powerful than before. Some were crying, others smiling through tears. No one spoke. James stepped aside, motioning for Keanu and Morgan to join him near the front of the stage. Together, the three men turned to face the crowd. In that instant, the air felt different, charged with something pure, almost spiritual. The story that began in a dusty workshop had come full circle in the most unexpected way. Keanu glanced toward the back of the hall, where a banner hung with the words, "Every life can rise again." He thought about all the men who would walk through those doors in the years to come, each one carrying a past, each one looking for light. He turned to James, smiling through his tears. "You've built something beautiful," he said quietly. James nodded, still struggling to speak. "Because you built me first." The hall erupted once more into applause, louder and longer than before. Cameras flashed, though no one seemed to care about the spectacle. It wasn't celebrity that filled the air, it was reverence. Everyone in that room understood they were witnessing something greater than fame, something raw and undeniably human. James wiped his face with the back of his hand, still laughing through the tears. "I promised myself I wouldn't cry today," he said, voice trembling with emotion. "But I guess some promises are worth breaking." Laughter broke through. The crowd, gentle and understanding. Even Morgan chuckled softly, patting James on the shoulder. "You've earned the right to cry, son," he said. "You've earned all of this." James looked at Keanu again, shaking his head slightly as though still trying to grasp the reality of it. "Do you remember that old workshop? The one with the broken lights and the leaking roof?" Keanu smiled faintly. "I do. You were sanding a stool that night, and you stayed hours after everyone left." James nodded. "You told me I could reframe what my past meant. I didn't understand it then. 7, but when I built this center, I realized you were right. I didn't have to erase who I was. I just had to rebuild what that story meant." Keanu's eyes shimmered, and for a moment, neither man spoke. The silence between them said everything. The applause continued, not as a celebration, but as a prayer, a collective release of gratitude from everyone who had ever been given a second chance. Former inmates, volunteers, and local families all clapped until their hands ached, cheering for the redemption of one man that somehow reflected their own struggles too. Morgan leaned in toward Keanu, his voice soft and full of pride. "Look at that, brother. One act of kindness 10 years ago turned into all this. That's legacy." Keanu nodded slowly, eyes locked on James. "No," he said quietly. "That's humanity." James stepped back toward the microphone, motioning for the applause to settle. His voice, still emotional but stronger now, filled the hall. "If there's one thing I've learned," he said, "it's that you can't walk this road alone. I didn't get here because I was strong. I got here because someone believed I could be." He turned to Keanu and Morgan again, his tone gentle but firm. "This center isn't mine. It's ours. Every person who ever refused to give up on someone belongs to it. It's built on faith, not fame." Keanu and Morgan exchanged a look, one of quiet understanding, the kind shared only by those who've seen life at its hardest and still choose compassion. The crowd stood again, clapping until the hall shook. James lifted his hand slightly, as if to embrace them all. And in that moment, surrounded by light, sound, and memory, the three men stood together, not as a celebrity, a legend, or a former convict, but simply as proof that belief can resurrect even the most broken soul. When the crowd finally dispersed, the late afternoon sunlight streamed softly through the glass walls of the Phoenix Life Center. The air still carried the warmth of the ceremony, laughter, gratitude, and quiet awe. James approached Keanu and Morgan, still looking overwhelmed by their presence. "I don't even know where to begin," he said, shaking his head. "But maybe I can show you instead." He led them through the hallways, where colorful murals painted by former inmates covered the walls. Each one told a story, hands breaking chains, bridges spanning rivers, faces looking upward toward light. James paused at one that showed a man standing in front of a half-built house. "That one's by Darren," he explained. "He spent 12 years in prison. Now he runs a construction business that employs other guys coming out of the system. Said he wanted to build homes because he knows what it's like not to have one." Keanu studied the mural closely. The detail, the rough texture, the emotion, it all spoke to resilience. "It's beautiful," he said softly. Morgan smiled. "That's what redemption looks like. Rough around the edges, but strong enough to stand." They continued walking until they reached a classroom where a small group of men sat around tables learning computer skills. A woman in her 50s, a teacher, looked up and smiled when she saw them. "Mr. Porter, these are our new students. Most of them just started this month." James introduced Keanu and Morgan, and the men in the room stood, clearly nervous but proud. One of them, a tall man with kind eyes, spoke up. "Sir, if I could say something?" He hesitated, then looked at James. I was in a cell 3 years ago, thinking I'd never be more than my mistakes. Then I saw an interview clip online, Mr. Reeves talking about believing in people who fall. I didn't even know this place existed back then. But that video kept me going until I got out. When I heard about B2, the Phoenix Center, I thought maybe it was a sign. Keanu looked stunned. You saw that? The man nodded. Every word. I still got it saved on my phone. You said forgiveness is something we should practice as much as justice. That changed me. Keanu smiled humbly. I'm glad it reached you, he said. But you're the one who walked through the door. That's where the real courage begins. James clapped the man gently on the shoulder. He's one of our best students now, he said. Helps others with resumes and job applications. The man grinned proudly. James gave me a reason to believe again. Morgan glanced around the room, his deep voice softening. That's worth more than any award, isn't it? They left the classroom and continued their tour through the main hall, where bulletin boards displayed before and after photos of graduates, mugshots beside new portraits, in work uniforms or family gatherings. One image showed a man hugging a young girl, both smiling with radiant joy. Beneath it, a caption read, "Reunited after 15 years." James paused by the picture. That's Leo, he said quietly. He came to us broken, angry, ready to give up. Now he owns a small landscaping company and volunteers here on weekends. He told me he used to think his daughter hated him. Turns out, she was just waiting for him to show up again. Keanu studied the photo for a long time. This place isn't just about reform, he said finally. It's about restoration. James nodded. Exactly. You can fix a record, but it means nothing if you don't fix the person. James led them into a workshop at the far end of the building. The scent of sawdust and varnish filled the air so familiar it made Keanu stop for a moment. Rows of workbenches stretched across the room, each occupied by men and women shaping wood into furniture, instruments, and art pieces. Sunlight poured through wide skylights, glinting off the freshly polished surfaces. This, James said with quiet pride, is where it all started. We modeled this space after the old community workshop where I first met you both. Even the benches are built to the same measurements. Keanu ran his hand over one of the tables, tracing the smooth grain of the wood. It feels the same, he said softly. Except this time, it's you teaching. James smiled. Funny thing is, I still use your words when I teach. Measure twice, cut once. Morgan chuckled, shaking his head. He actually listened to you, Keanu. That's a first. Keanu laughed quietly, the moment both light and tender, but his gaze lingered on James. Seeing the teacher, he had become a man, once buried by guilt, now helping others find worth in their hands. As they walked further, they passed a wall covered in plaques and small cards. Each card had a name, a date, and a single line of writing. James explained, "Those are our graduates. Each one leaves a message for the next class. Some are prayers, some are promises." Keanu stopped at one card that read, "This place didn't give me a new life. It reminded me I still had one." He swallowed hard. "You built a living legacy, James." James nodded slowly. Part of the funding came from donations, some big, some small. But the biggest help came from something unexpected. Someone had uploaded an old video of you two teaching at the halfway house. It went viral years later. That video inspired people to donate from all over the country. Morgan grinned. "Guess our royalties went to good use." James laughed. "Better than any movie ticket I ever bought." They moved toward the exit, sunlight washing over them through the glass doors. Outside, laughter and music from the celebration drifted faintly through the air. James paused, looking back at the center, the walls, the rooms, the people, and said quietly, "Everything I built here came from the belief you gave me." Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder. "No, James, it came from the belief you kept. By the time the ceremony ended, the sun had begun to dip behind the rolling hills. The last few guests drifted out of the Phoenix Life Center, their laughter echoing faintly through the courtyard. Banners fluttered in the soft evening breeze, and paper cups and confetti lay scattered across the walkway like quiet reminders of celebration. Inside, the main lights had been dimmed, leaving the lobby bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. Keanu stood alone near the front desk, his jacket slung over his arm. The sound of distant music and chatter came from outside, where families lingered, taking photos under the center's sign. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a slim checkbook. For a long moment, he stared at the blank line where the amount would go. He thought about James, the man who had once been broken beyond recognition, now standing tall, helping others rise. He thought about the faces of the men they'd met during the tour, the laughter of children running through the halls, the words written on the wall. Every life can rise again. Quietly, he wrote the number a sum large enough to secure the center's future for years to come. But he didn't sign it with his name. Instead, he wrote 2 words on the memo line: anonymous donation. Next, he took out a small piece of paper and wrote a note in his steady, careful handwriting. To those who keep rebuilding what others throw away, thank you. He folded it neatly, slipped it into an envelope with the check, and placed it beneath the volunteer donation box on the counter. He didn't hesitate, didn't second guess. To him, it wasn't charity, it was gratitude. A way of honoring a promise that began 10 years earlier in a dusty workshop filled with forgotten men. Morgan appeared behind him, his footsteps slow and familiar. "You really think you can sneak something like that past me?" he said, his voice a blend of amusement and affection. Keanu turned slightly, caught but unbothered. "You saw?" Morgan chuckled. "Son, I've been watching you for decades. You've got to tell you get quiet when you're about to do something good." Keanu smiled faintly. "Then I must be quiet a lot." Morgan raised an eyebrow. "You are, and that's why it always means something when you speak." He nodded toward the envelope on the counter. "Still the silent benefactor, huh?" Keanu shrugged, glancing at the note one last time. "Some stories aren't meant to be told," he said softly. "They're meant to be lived." Morgan's smile lingered. "And this one, my friend, is going to live long after both of us are gone." Keanu looked out the glass doors toward the courtyard, where families were gathering in small groups. The sound of children's laughter floated through the warm evening air. For the first time that day, he allowed himself to exhale fully, a sense of peace settling deep within him. Morgan followed Keanu outside, the door closing softly behind them. The evening sky was painted in shades of amber and violet, the last of the sunlight glinting off the glass walls of the center. The courtyard had mostly emptied, though a few families lingered, former inmates reunited with children, wives, and parents. The air carried a gentle hum of laughter and music, the kind that only comes from peace earned the hard way. Keanu and Morgan walked over to a low stone bench facing the horizon. For a while, neither spoke. They simply sat there, watching a group of men from the program toss a football back and forth while their kids ran barefoot on the grass. The sight of it, simple, ordinary, and pure, seemed to carry more meaning than any speech or award could. Morgan leaned back, his hands resting on his knees. "You know," he said quietly, "I've been to a lot of ceremonies, seen a lot of good deeds, but this one felt different." Keanu nodded, eyes fixed on the fading light. "It's because this wasn't about fixing the world. It was about healing it, one life at a time." Morgan smiled faintly. "You always were the philosopher." "Not really," Keanu said with a small laugh. "Just someone who's seen what happens when people stop believing in each other." Across the courtyard, James appeared in the doorway, now dressed in a simple sweater instead of his suit. He spotted them and started walking over, his steps slow, reflective. When he reached them, he smiled. "I didn't think you'd still be here." Keanu gestured toward the horizon. "We didn't want to leave before sunset." James followed his gaze, nodding. "You know, every night I stand here and watch this sky. It reminds me that no matter how dark the day gets, the light always comes back. Maybe not the same way, maybe not as bright, but it always returns." Morgan looked at him, pride in his eyes. "That's wisdom right there." James laughed softly. "Guess I had good teachers." For a while, the three men sat in silence, the golden light stretching across the field. Then James said quietly, "When I started this place, I thought about that old workshop, about the day you both told me to keep building. I wanted this center to be a place where broken things are turned into something beautiful." Keanu smiled gently. "Looks like you succeeded." "I'm still working on it," James said. "There's always another person out there who needs a chance." Keanu looked at him, the corners of his mouth lifting. Then, "Keep doing what you're doing. That's how the light stays alive." As the last bit of sun disappeared behind the hills, laughter echoed one final time across the courtyard. James rose first, saying goodnight, leaving Keanu and Morgan alone again. They sat there for several more minutes, watching the sky shift from gold to deep blue. Morgan finally stood, stretching his back. "Ready to go?" Keanu glanced once more at the center, glowing softly behind them. "In a minute," he said. "I just want to remember this view." He watched as the lights flickered on inside the Phoenix Life Center, illuminating the faces of families still talking and laughing. It was a quiet kind of miracle, one built not on fame or fortune, but faith. That night, long after the guests had gone and the lights of the Phoenix Life Center had dimmed, James Porter sat alone in his office. The building was quiet now, filled only with the faint hum of the air conditioner and the distant chirping of crickets outside. The adrenaline from the ceremony had finally settled, leaving behind a calm that felt almost sacred. On his desk lay a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with years of handwritten entries, notes, prayers, confessions, and hopes. He opened it slowly to a fresh page, the faint scratch of the pen against paper echoing in the silence. March 12th. The night everything came full circle. He paused, letting the ink dry for a moment. Before continuing, "I saw them again today. The two men who changed everything. The ones who believed in me before I even knew how to believe in myself. I thought I'd be able to keep my composure, to speak without breaking. But when I saw them in that crowd, it felt like time folded in on itself." His handwriting wavered slightly as he continued. 10 years ago, I was a man sitting in a cold room with no idea what the word hope even meant. I remember the way the sawdust smelled, how the light from the windows looked dull, filtered through grime. And then Keanu walked in, quiet, humble, kind, not the movie star, not the name everyone knows, just a man who looked at me like I still mattered. That day was the day the light came in. James leaned back in his chair, staring out the window into the dark. The reflection of his face overlapped faintly with the glowing sign outside that read Phoenix Life Center. For a moment, it almost looked like both versions of himself. The broken man he once was, and the man he'd become, were standing in the same frame. He picked up the pen again. "They didn't fix me. They never tried to. They just showed me that I could fix myself, that I wasn't finished yet. I used to think kindness was a weakness. Now I know it's the strongest thing a man can give." He smiled faintly as the words settled into the page. His gaze shifted to the framed photograph on the corner of his desk, the same one Keanu had paused at earlier that day. It was a photo taken years ago at the old workshop. Keanu in his faded denim shirt, Morgan in his work vest, and James between them, younger, uncertain, but smiling for the first time in years. "I keep this photo here to remind me where I came from," he wrote. Every time I doubt myself, I look at it. And I remember that redemption isn't about forgetting the past. It's about honoring it. He set the pen down, rubbing his tired eyes. The day had been long, but his heart felt light. He whispered softly to the empty room. "You did it, James. You finally did it." Then came a gentle knock at the door. James looked up from his journal, surprised by the sound. For a brief moment, he thought it might be a janitor finishing up for the night, but then he heard a familiar voice, soft, hesitant, and full of warmth. "Dad? Can I come in?" His heart tightened. "Yeah, sweetheart, come on in." The door opened, and his daughter Emily stepped into the room. She was 16 now, tall and confident, with the same curious eyes she had when she was a child. In her hands was a small bouquet of wildflowers she must have picked from the garden outside. "I saw you sitting here," she said gently, walking closer. "Everyone's gone home. I thought you might still be working." James smiled and shook his head. "Just writing a little, trying to make sense of everything that happened today." She looked at the open journal on his desk. "I heard your speech earlier," she said. "It was amazing. Everyone was crying, even me." James laughed quietly. "You cried?" She nodded. "A little. It's just, I've heard you talk about the past before, but never like that. You sounded proud of it, not ashamed." James's smile softened. "That's because for a long time, I carried my past like a punishment. But today, standing in front of all those people, I realized it's actually a gift. Everything I went through, it led me here, to this place, to you." Emily set the flowers on his desk and sat down beside him. "You know," she said, "when I was younger, I used to tell people you worked at a construction site. I didn't really know what you did. Now I finally get it." He raised an eyebrow playfully. "Oh yeah? And what do I do?" She smiled, her eyes glistening. "You rebuild people. You help them find themselves again." Those words struck him harder than she could have imagined. For a moment, he couldn't speak. He reached over and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm proud of you, Emily," he said softly. "You grew up strong. You grew up kind." She stood and wrapped her arms around him, hugging him tightly. "No, Dad," she whispered. "I'm proud of you." The words broke something open in him. He closed his proud eyes, holding her close, feeling the weight of every year he'd spent trying to become worthy of this moment. The little girl he once lost was now the young woman who had found her way back to him, not through luck, but through grace. When she finally pulled back, he saw tears in her eyes, though she smiled brightly. "Come home soon, okay? It's late." "I will," he said, his voice rough but calm. She left the office quietly, closing the door behind her. James sat back in his chair, glancing once more at the journal. He wrote a final line at the bottom of the page. "Tonight, my past finally forgave me." He closed the journal gently, resting his hand on its cover. On the desk, the photo of Keanu, Morgan, and himself caught the faint glow of the lamp. For the first time in his life, James didn't see three men from different worlds, he saw family. He leaned back, whispering to the quiet room. The circles closed. By the next morning, the story had spread farther than anyone expected. The Phoenix Life Center's small town was suddenly swarmed by journalists and camera crews eager to capture the story of what had unfolded the day before. News vans lined the street outside the building, and headlines appeared across morning broadcasts. Keanu Reeves and Morgan Freeman reunite with former prisoner turned community leader. What began as a local human interest piece quickly turned into a national headline. The footage of James Porter stepping down from the podium and embracing Keanu and Morgan replayed across every major network. It wasn't the celebrity moment that captured people, it was the emotion. The raw, unfiltered humanity of a man redeemed by belief. and two men who had given him that chance. Social media caught fire. Clips of the speech went viral on every platform. On one post, someone wrote, "Keanu Reeves and Morgan Freeman didn't just visit prisoners, they planted hope that grew into leadership." The post was shared hundreds of thousands of times. Comments flooded in from viewers around the world. Some said it restored their faith in humanity. Others said it reminded them that second chances were possible, even for those who'd fallen the hardest. Within a day, the Phoenix Life Center's website crashed under the weight of donations and inquiries. Former inmates, social workers, and teachers wrote letters asking how to start similar programs in their own communities. One comment read, "If two people can change one man, imagine what a nation could do if we all believed like that." Keanu, however, avoided interviews. He had returned to Los Angeles quietly, declining every press request that came his way. When one reporter caught up with him outside a film studio and asked why he hadn't spoken publicly about the event, he simply smiled and said, "It wasn't about us. It was about James finding himself." Those few words were replayed endlessly on TV, quoted in articles and shared across social media. But Keanu didn't watch. He spent that morning alone at his favorite cafe, sitting by the window with a cup of black coffee, reading an old paperback book. When a customer approached to thank him for what he'd done, he shook his head gently and replied, "All I did was show up. The rest was his story." Morgan, on the other hand, did agree to one brief interview. When asked what the experience meant to him, he leaned back in his chair, smiled thoughtfully, and said, "You never lose when you invest in people. Sometimes the return takes years to show up, but when it does, it's worth more than anything money can buy." The clip of that quote aired across the evening news, alongside footage of the Phoenix Life Center glowing under the California sunset. As the story continued to ripple across the country, talk shows and podcasts picked it up, each trying to capture what had made this moment so powerful. It wasn't just the fame of Keanu Reeves and Morgan Freeman, it was what they represented. Viewers described the event as a masterclass in humility, proof that quiet kindness still matters, and the real meaning of mentorship. Clips from the ceremony circulated with emotional captions. "This is what hope looks like, and redemption has a face, and it's smiling." Comment sections filled with stories from people who had once been incarcerated, thanking the Phoenix Life Center for giving them inspiration to change. One man wrote, "I don't know James Porter, but I know his story, because it's mine too." Overnight, the Phoenix Life Center's donation fund tripled. Community leaders from across the country began calling to learn how to replicate the model. Rehabilitation organizations requested blueprints for the program. Within a week, the governor's office released a statement acknowledging the center as a model for reentry success and human dignity. Yet through it all, James Porter stayed grounded. When reporters asked him about the attention, he smiled shyly and said, "This isn't a story about celebrities saving someone. It's a story about faith, that if you give someone room to grow, they will." His voice trembled when he added, "What Mr. Reeves and Mr. Freeman gave me wasn't fame or opportunity. They gave me time, and time turned into trust." Photos of James standing in front of the Phoenix Life Center sign, wearing his simple gray suit and modest smile, became the face of second chances in America. But when asked about the men who inspired him, James always deflected the praise. "They're not heroes," he told one reporter. "They're gardeners. They planted something small in me, and I just kept watering it." In Los Angeles, Keanu stayed true to his quiet nature. He made no public statement, gave no interviews, and declined to attend any award ceremonies that tried to recognize him. When a journalist emailed him a question about the viral story, he replied with just one sentence, "If kindness becomes news, it means we've forgotten it should be normal." Morgan, on the other hand, accepted one final interview on a Sunday morning program. Dressed in his usual simple elegance, he sat in front of the camera and smiled softly when asked what the experience had taught him. "It reminded me," he said slowly, that the work we do off camera is the work that defines who we are. Fame fades, lights fade, applause fades, but what remains is the echo of how we treat others. You never lose when you invest in people. The interviewer asked if he thought James Porter's transformation was rare. Morgan shook his head. No. I think there are 1,000 James Porters out there, waiting for someone to see them. The question is, how many of us are willing to look? That clip became the final punctuation mark of the story. Across the country, churches, schools, and community centers shared it during meetings and sermons. News outlets stopped framing it as a celebrity story and began calling it the Phoenix Movement. Weeks later, the media frenzy began to calm, but its effect lingered. Donations continued to pour in. New centers began forming in other states, each one inspired by the same philosophy: belief before judgment. And through it all, Keanu and Morgan remained silent, not out of indifference, but out of reverence. They understood something most headlines missed: that true change never needs to announce itself. It just grows quietly, until one day the world looks up and realizes that hope has already taken root. 2 months after the ceremony, the world had slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The frenzy of headlines and interviews had faded, leaving behind a quieter legacy. The Phoenix Life Center was thriving. New programs were being added, and the men who once lived in shadows were now mentors themselves. Yet, even in the calm, the story refused to die. It was on a warm afternoon in Los Angeles that Keanu received an unexpected visitor at his office. A young woman named Clara Wynn, a documentary filmmaker in her late 20s, arrived with a camera bag slung over her shoulder and a spark of determination in her eyes. She had been deeply moved by the Phoenix story and had an idea that, as she put it, could make that light reach even further. "I want to make a short documentary," she said earnestly. "Not about fame, not about Hollywood, but about what happens when someone is truly given a second chance. I want to call it The Second Chance." It would follow James's journey, the creation of the center, and what it means for others who are trying to start over. Keanu listened in silence, his hands clasped loosely in front of him. He wasn't a man who jumped at publicity. In fact, he spent most of his life avoiding it. But something in her tone, the sincerity, the quiet urgency, reminded him of the same spark he had once seen in James. Clara continued, "I don't want a studio or a network behind it. I want it small, real, and raw. I want it to live where it matters, in schools, in community centers, in prisons. I believe people need to see what belief can do." Keanu thought for a long moment before speaking. "If we do this," he said slowly, "it can't be about me or Morgan. It has to be about them, the men and women rebuilding their lives. The story has to stay honest." "That's exactly what I want," Clara said. "Honesty, not headlines." He gave a faint nod. "Then I'll do it. But on one condition." Clara leaned forward. "Anything." "All profits," Keanu said, "go to education programs for former inmates. Every dollar." Clara smiled, relief flooding her face. "That's perfect. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say." Within weeks, she and her small crew arrived at the Phoenix Life Center with their cameras. James greeted them warmly, amused and slightly nervous at the idea of being filmed. "I'm no actor," he warned with a grin. "You don't need to be," Clara replied. "You just have to be yourself. That's the story." They began filming quietly. No bright lights, no staged moments. Clara's camera followed James through the classrooms and workshops, capturing his daily interactions with the people he now called his family. They filmed the laughter, the lessons, the tears. They filmed Keanu visiting the center again, not as a guest of honor, but as a quiet presence, helping fix a broken light fixture, shaking hands, listening more than he spoke. Intimate and unfiltered, every shot carried the weight of truth, the scrape of saws on wood, The sound of pens scribbling across notebooks, the echo of doors opening where once they had only closed. One of the most emotional moments came halfway through filming. Clara had arranged for James to visit his old prison, the same facility where he had spent 6 years of his life. The idea made him uneasy at first, but Keanu encouraged him gently. "Sometimes," he said, "you have to face the place that tried to bury you, just to prove you can still walk free." When they arrived, the guards recognized James immediately. Word of his transformation had spread even there. They shook his hand as he entered the courtyard, a place that once felt endless and gray. Now, it looked smaller somehow, less powerful. James walked slowly, the camera following as he approached his old cell. The number B23 was still stenciled on the rusted door. He reached out and ran his fingers over the cold metal, his expression unreadable. "This is where I stopped believing in myself," he said softly, "and where two strangers unknowingly started to change that." He stepped inside the cell. It was empty now, just a narrow cot and a barred window letting in a sliver of daylight. He took a deep breath, then pulled a small plaque from his jacket pocket. It was bronze, no bigger than his hand, engraved with the words, "Forgiven, not forgotten." Clara filmed as he placed it gently on the wall near the window. His voice broke when he said, "I'm not leaving this here for me. I'm leaving it for whoever sleeps here next to remind them that the walls don't decide who you are." Outside the cell, Keanu stood quietly in the hallway. His head bowed. He didn't say a word, and Clara didn't ask him to. She later said his silence was more powerful than any speech. In another scene, the cameras captured Keanu and James walking through the Phoenix workshop as students worked around them. A young man named Victor approached with trembling hands, saying, "I saw the clip about this program when I was still inside. It gave me something to hold on to. You two saved my life." Keanu smiled gently. "No, Victor, you saved it. We just reminded you it was worth saving." Those quiet exchanges became the soul of the second chance. There were no elaborate sets, no narration, no music meant to dramatize emotion, just real people, real words, and real redemption. When filming wrapped, Clara showed the rough cut to Keanu, Morgan, and James in the small screening room at the Phoenix Life Center. The lights dimmed, and the room filled with the flicker of their story workshops, laughter, classrooms, tears, and the shot of James placing the plaque in his old cell. When the credits rolled, no one spoke. Keanu sat still, his hands clasped, his eyes glistening. After a long silence, he whispered, "You got it right." Clara turned, her voice shaking slightly. "It wasn't me. It was all of you." Morgan leaned back in his chair, smiling quietly. "No," he said. "It was belief, caught on camera." Outside, the night was calm, and through the glass walls of the center, they could see lights glowing in every classroom. Life continued, men and women learning, growing, healing. The story wasn't over. It was just being told anew. Several months later, the message born from the Phoenix Life Center had taken on a life of its own. Across the country, new mentorship programs were forming, small community workshops, educational initiatives in prisons, and volunteer-driven centers that carried the same spirit of second chances. People had begun calling it the Phoenix Model, a quiet movement built not on fame or funding, but on compassion and belief. It was during this wave of renewed hope that Keanu and Morgan were invited to speak at a national youth conference in Chicago. The event brought together educators, social workers, volunteers, students from all over the country who were eager to make a difference. The auditorium was packed, the air buzzing with youthful energy and anticipation. As they took the stage, a standing ovation greeted them, not for their movie careers, but for the lives they had touched beyond the screen. Keanu wore a simple dark jacket, his expression humble as always, while Morgan, with his trademark calm dignity, stepped to the microphone first. He began by thanking the crowd, then said, "You know, I've spent my life telling stories for a living, but the greatest stories I've ever witnessed weren't written in scripts or played out on movie sets. They were written in the hearts of people who refused to give up on themselves or on each other. The room fell into attentive silence. Morgan continued. We've learned that true change doesn't come from systems alone. It comes from connection. You can't pour hope into someone else unless your cup is full of grace. And grace isn't something you earn. It's something you choose to give over and over, even when the world tells you not to. His words lingered in the air. Teachers and volunteers in the front rows nodded, some wiping away quiet tears. When Morgan stepped back, Keanu moved forward. His voice, calm but steady, carried through the hall. I'm not here to tell you how to save the world, he said, because none of us can do that alone. But I am here to tell you this. You don't have to change the world to make it better. Sometimes changing one life is enough. He paused, letting the words breathe. 10 years ago, I met a man named James Porter. He didn't think he had a future. He didn't think he deserved one. But someone believed in him. And he decided to believe too. That single decision, his decision, built something that now changes hundreds of lives every year. The audience was silent, completely focused on his voice. Keanu looked out at the faces students, teachers, counselors, each one carrying their own story of struggle and purpose. You never know who you're saving, he said quietly, and most of the time, you'll never see the end of that story. But believe me, it continues. It grows. It echoes. Morgan returned to stand beside him, nodding. And that echo, my friends, is the sound of legacy. The room erupted in applause, rising to their feet once more. It wasn't the applause of celebrity adoration. It was gratitude, a recognition that what they'd heard wasn't a performance. It was truth. After the applause settled, the moderator invited Keanu and Morgan to sit for a brief Q&A. Hands shot up immediately across the auditorium. Young faces full of energy and purpose. A college student stood first. Mr. Reeves, she asked nervously, how do you keep believing in people when the world feels so cynical? Keanu smiled gently. By remembering that cynicism is easy, he said, but compassion takes strength. When you choose to believe in people, even when they disappoint you, you remind them that goodness still exists. And sometimes, that's all it takes for them to find it in themselves. The room grew quiet again. The next question came from a middle-aged teacher in the third row. Mr. Freeman, what advice would you give those of us working with kids who've already given up on themselves? Morgan leaned forward, his deep voice steady and kind. Remind them they're not broken, he said. They're just waiting for someone to listen. Every young person needs to see themselves through someone else's belief before they can find their own. Be that mirror. Applause followed each answer. Then a social worker near the back asked, do you think the Phoenix Life Center is a one-time miracle, or can this really work everywhere? Keanu exchanged a glance with Morgan before replying. It's not a miracle, he said simply. It's a model. It works wherever someone chooses to believe. You don't need fame or money to do it. You just need time, empathy, and the courage to show up. That line, the courage to show up, was repeated for weeks afterward. As the session ended, dozens of young teachers, volunteers, and program leaders surrounded the two men, thanking them for the story of James Porter. Some shared how they were starting after-school mentorships or writing grants to open workshops in their own towns. One young man said, I was planning to leave social work, but after hearing this, I think I'll stay. Maybe the change I want to see just takes longer than I thought. Morgan placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. Change always takes longer, he said. But when it comes, it lasts longer too. Before leaving, the event organizers presented Keanu and Morgan with a framed photo of the Phoenix Life Center surrounded by its graduates. Below it was a quote from the day's talk. You don't have to change the world to make it better. Sometimes changing one life is enough. Keanu accepted it quietly, his eyes reflecting both pride and humility. "Thank you," he said softly. "Just make sure the next story you tell belongs to someone who needs to be heard." That evening, as the two men left the auditorium, the sun was setting again, another golden sky, much like the one outside the Phoenix Life Center months before. They walked in silence for a while before Morgan finally said, "You know, I think James would have been proud of today." Keanu smiled. "No doubt," he said, "because it wasn't really about us, it was about what we passed on." As they reached their car, Keanu looked back one last time at the building full of young people inside. Their voices echoed faintly, full of hope, determination, and belief. The torch had been passed, and the quiet, humble lesson of second chances was alive and spreading. 1 year passed quietly, but the ripple that began at the Phoenix Life Center never stopped spreading. The small-town facility that started with one man's dream had grown into a movement. 2 new centers had opened, one in Nevada and another in Oregon, each modeled after James Porter's original vision. Together, they served hundreds of men and women, rebuilding their lives. The walls of every center carried the same inscription that Keanu once read on the original building: "Every life can rise again." It had become the motto of a growing community of teachers, volunteers, and former inmates who believed in the healing power of purpose. James Porter was now busier than ever. His days were spent traveling across the country, mentoring new directors, giving talks at community colleges, and meeting local leaders interested in adopting his rehabilitation model. But no matter where he went, he always carried with him the same small notebook, the journal that held his thoughts from that. The first night after the ceremony, one crisp autumn afternoon, James returned home to the original Phoenix Life Center for a workshop session. He loved being back among the sawdust, the sound of hammers, and the laughter of students learning the trades that had once saved him. The workshop looked almost identical to the one he had started years ago. Rows of benches, wood piled neatly, and walls lined with finished projects. He moved through the room, helping a student adjust a clamp, correcting another's grip on a chisel. "Take your time," he said. "Wood teaches patience. Rush it, and it'll splinter. Respect it, and it'll hold." The young men and women nodded, following his advice with quiet focus. For James, this was more than teaching, it was passing on something sacred. Every time a student sanded a piece of wood smooth, it felt like the rough edges of his own past being softened again. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the walls in warm amber. The place felt alive, humming with purpose. It wasn't just a center anymore. It was a sanctuary. Then, as James bent over a student's workbench to demonstrate a cut, a familiar voice came from behind him. "Still giving orders, I see." James froze. He turned around, his eyes widening with disbelief before breaking into a grin. Standing by the doorway, dressed simply in a worn leather jacket and jeans, was Keanu Reeves. "Keanu?" James said, laughing as he wiped his hands on his apron. "You didn't tell me you were coming." "I didn't want to make it a big deal," Keanu replied with his usual calm smile. "Just passing through town and thought I'd stop by." James shook his head, still smiling. "You don't just stop by from Los Angeles." "Maybe not," Keanu said, chuckling softly, "but I missed the smell of sawdust." The class noticed who had arrived and quietly stepped aside, watching as the two men clasped hands and pulled each other into a long, genuine hug. The embrace lingered longer than either expected. When they finally pulled apart, both men were smiling with the quiet understanding that only comes from shared history. James looked older now, a touch more gray in his beard, but his eyes were bright and alive. "You picked a good day to visit," he said. "We're teaching a beginner woodworking class. It's the same one you taught me in that old halfway house." Keanu glanced around the workshop, taking in the sight of the students bent over their projects. "It looks almost the same," he said softly. "Same smell, same tools, same hope." James laughed. Yeah, but this time, it's me running the show. Imagine that. Keanu leaned against one of the workbenches, watching a young man carefully sand the edge of a wooden stool. You've built something incredible here, he said. Not just a building, a whole new beginning for people. James picked up a piece of unfinished wood, running his hand over its playing. Surface. You know, he said, when I was in prison, I used to think life was like this rough, uneven, impossible to shape. But then someone handed me a piece of sandpaper and told me to start small. You were that person. Keanu looked at him, his expression filled with quiet respect. You gave me too much credit, James. You did the hard part. James shook his head. No, I did what you told me to do. I kept showing up. For a moment, they stood there in comfortable silence, surrounded by the hum of saws and the rhythm of hands shaping wood. The sound was steady, grounding, almost musical. It reminded them both of where it had all begun. After a while, James turned to Keanu and said softly, "You gave me a second chance." Keanu's gaze didn't waver. You gave it meaning. Those few words hung in the air like a benediction. A couple of students nearby paused their work, not wanting to interrupt, but knowing they had witnessed something deeply human. James smiled, eyes glistening. You know, I tell my students that building something out of nothing isn't about the wood or the nails. It's about the patience to believe that something beautiful can come from broken pieces. Keanu nodded slowly. That's life, he said. You can't erase the cracks. You just build around them. They walked together through the workshop, stopping to admire the projects in progress bookshelves, chairs, and carved plaques with inspirational quotes. Near the back, one student had burned the words, "Forgiven, not forgotten," into a slab of oak. Keanu smiled faintly when he saw it. That phrase, he said, it's starting to travel. James chuckled. Good. Maybe that's how we keep the light moving. As the afternoon sun poured through the windows, the two men stood side by side, watching the students work, men and women, shaping something solid, something they could hold. From above, the sound of sandpaper against wood filled the air, steady and calm, like a heartbeat. And as Keanu looked around the room, he realized that every wall, every smile, and every sound in that place was a living echo of grace proof. That second chances don't just rebuild lives, they build legacies. Night had fallen over Los Angeles. The city shimmered below, a sea of gold and silver lights stretching endlessly to the horizon. From a quiet overlook high in the Hollywood Hills, Keanu Reeves and Morgan Freeman sat side by side, sharing the stillness. The noise of the world was far away up here, no crowds, no cameras, just the whisper of wind and the hum of distant traffic. Keanu held a cup of coffee in his hands, its warmth fading slowly as he looked out across the skyline. The silence between them was easy, the kind that comes only between friends who don't need words to understand one another. Finally, Morgan spoke. You know, he said, his voice low and thoughtful. I've been thinking about James, about that moment in the hall when he hugged us. It's funny how something so simple can feel bigger than any red carpet I've ever walked. Keanu smiled faintly. Yeah, it's the kind of moment that doesn't need an audience to matter. Morgan nodded. People talk about fame and awards like they mean something, but they fade. This what happened with James and everyone that came after him. This is immortality. It's the kind of legacy that doesn't die when your name disappears from the headlines. Keanu looked down at the cup in his hands, then out toward the glowing sprawl of the city. Immortality, he repeated softly. Not through the movies, but through moments that last in other people's lives. He thought about James teaching his class, the students sanding wood with steady hands. He thought about Emily hugging her father and saying she was proud. And he thought about all the faces they'd never see, the men and women whose stories would begin because someone believed in them. Morgan leaned back, his eyes still on the skyline. "You ever notice," he said, "how kindness has a way of circling back? You pour it out, and years later it comes knocking again, wearing a different face." Keanu nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's like a chain that never breaks, even when you can't see the links." They sat in silence again for a while, both men watching as the city lights flickered like stars trapped in motion. There was something comforting about it, this quiet truth, that goodness, once set in motion, kept moving long after the hands that started it were gone. Keanu finally said, "You know, I used to think second chances were about fixing mistakes, but they're not. They're about seeing people as they could be, not just as they were." Morgan smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "That's it, son. That's the secret most folks never figure out." Keanu turned toward him. "What's that?" "That compassion isn't charity," Morgan said. "It's understanding. You don't give second chances because people deserve them. You give them because someone once gave you one too." The words hung in the cool night air, like a truth neither man needed to question. Keanu smiled quietly, letting the meaning of Morgan's words settle. He thought back to his own life, the people who had shown him grace when the world wasn't kind. His mother, who worked endlessly to keep their family afloat. The teachers who believed in him when he was just a drifting young man. Friends who stood by him through loss and grief. And now, men like James Porter, who proved that redemption was not a destination, but a daily choice. "I guess that's what this all comes down to," Keanu said softly. "Someone once believed in me, and I just passed it on." Morgan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And now James is doing the same. That's how legacy works, Keanu. Not through fame or fortune, but through faith." The breeze grew cooler, carrying the faint hum of the city below. The lights looked like constellations sprawled across the earth, each one representing a story, a life, a chance. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You know what I realized at the Phoenix Center?" he said. "All those men, all those students, they weren't looking for someone to save them. They were looking for someone to believe they could save themselves." Morgan smiled. "That's why it worked. You never tried to be their hero. You just showed them they already had the tools to build something better." They sat quietly again for a while, the kind of stillness that doesn't need filling. Then Morgan broke the silence with a gentle laugh. "You ever think about how much simpler the world would be if everyone believed like that?" Keanu chuckled. "Maybe one day, but for now, I'm happy knowing that one life changed can lead to hundreds more." Morgan raised his cup of tea in a small toast. "To second chances." Keanu lifted his own cup. "And to those who never stopped giving them." The two men clinked their cups softly, the sound small but profound against the backdrop of the endless city below. For a while, they simply watched the lights twinkle in the distance. It wasn't just Los Angeles they were seeing. It was the reflection of everything they had learned. That kindness, when given freely, could move mountains. That faith, when shared, could rebuild lives. And that hope, once planted, never truly died. Keanu turned to Morgan with a quiet smile. "You ever wonder how many lives James has changed now?" Morgan exhaled, his voice warm. "Probably more than he'll ever know. That's the beauty of it. You don't need to see the full picture to trust that it's beautiful." Keanu nodded slowly. "Second chances aren't given," he said softly. "They're shared. And when you share them, the world becomes whole again." The city lights shimmered like stars. As the camera slowly panned out, the two men sitting in peaceful silence. The story that began in a dusty workshop years ago had come full circle, not with applause or headlines, but with quiet gratitude and grace. Have you ever given someone a second chance that changed their life or yours? What story of redemption and kindness should we tell next about Keanu Reeves?